Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History's Agenda. Tonight, we have part one of Dom and I's interview with David Whelan, the man that wrote the book, Mind Games, The Assassination of John Lennon. He is the foremost researcher into this event, this assassination, and we are lucky enough. We had like a 3-hour interview with him, and tonight we're going to give you part one. A couple things I do want to mention that on our podcast, Dom and I did on the assassination of John Lennon just reached 20,000 downloads. And I want to thank you for all that hard work and that you've all appreciated. So thank you very much. That is, out of all the podcasts I do, that is the greatest return. And I want to thank you. And please keep liking, keep subscribing, keep listening. David is the foremost authority into this area, and you will find by listening to him, the detail of his knowledge is amazing. A couple things I want to mention. We had a couple of technical difficulties. So you may some camera issues on Dom's camera, so you may see me not in my chair, or you may not see Dom during the interview, and it was just a couple of little blurbs there. With no further ado, part one of our interview with David Whelan. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History's Agenda. We are so lucky, Dom and I, to have David Whelan with us today. The follow-up from our other podcast regarding the assassination of John Lennon. David is, in our eyes, and I don't mean to speak for you, Dom, one of the foremost authorities on this assassination about everything.
He's the guy that literally wrote the book.
Wrote the book, yeah.
He wrote the book.
Here we go. We all have it next to us. Mind Games, The Assassination of John Lennon is, matter of fact, it's not only a good book, it's marvelously written.
Thank you.
It's almost conversational, where you're saying, hey, look here, look at this. This doesn't make sense, but don't believe me. Keep looking. Look yourself. And it's really the way when you talk about these conspiracies, and we talked a little bit about before RFK, JFK, we all know the stories. But I think this goes with the book and everything. We don't know who or why, even though we can surmise. All we have is the facts. And we ask our listeners or readers or everything to look at those facts and reach your own conclusion. You know, and when things don't make sense, you know, I'm always troubled. I'm a logical thinker, obviously. When things don't make sense, means you do not have all the facts. As we said, David, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for those kind words. It's lovely to be here.
So, Dom, you want to start us off, or you?
Yeah, just David, how did you get into the subject in the first place?
I think, like you guys, always fascinated by the JFK case. I've always had that as a point of interest in my life. The Oliver Stone film in '91 just completely blew me away. That was my, to coin a cliche, red pill moment. I have Irish parentage, so JFK in my family was a big deal. You know, he's kind of like a Irish royalty, really. His picture was on the walls when I was growing up in all the different family houses and stuff. And when I saw that film, I just thought, wow, we've been lied to. There was a lot more to his assassination than a lone nut. So that was always in the back of my mind. But I've had a busy career in television, mainly sports, actually, nothing to do in the sort of the height of my career in TV. But I have worked in TV news as well when I was working my way up. So I've done a lot of research as well, which is important, I think, doing this kind of work. A lot of film research, a lot of news research. So it all sort of moved up to 2020, guys, where I was like everybody, just twiddling my thumbs. And in the early days of the lockdown, quite enjoying parking everything. And just, for the first time in a long, long time, I felt like I had a free mind and it was open and I was relaxed and I was actually really enjoying it, to be honest with you. Lots of long walks with the dogs and stuff. And just, yeah, it was great. Lovely to put everything on pause. And I was just listening to a podcast, which you guys probably know, called Black Ops Radio, which is a JFK assassination podcast with brilliant Len Osanic. And they were talking about the JFK, obviously. And then Jim D'Eugenio, the brilliant researcher who's often featured on the show, he got to a letters section at the end of the show. Now, normally at this point, and no offense to Jim, but I turn off that point. I think I've heard all the main information in the show, so I'm just going to now move on and go to another podcast. But for some reason, thank God I did, I kept listening. And someone wrote a letter into Jim and Len on this show saying, what do you think about the doorman at the Dakota when John Lennon got assassinated being a CIA operative? And I just thought, wow, that's interesting. Never knew that before, because my only previous thing about the Lennon assassination was as a 14-year-old being told it was a lone nut who had a book and he was a bit crazy and he was a Lennon fan and he shot John and it's an open and shut case and he admitted it. So I never bothered to even think about it. It was just so obvious that this guy who admitted it did it. So that can't have been a JFK sort of thing. But this CIA sort of guy, that's interesting. So I went home that day, literally that day, started to Google this doorman, Jose Padermo, Cuban. And there was a Jose Padermo who was a CIA operative, very serious dude, who was head of an assassination group called Op 40, a bunch of right-wing Cubans who were going to go in after the Bay of Pigs and do a cleanup for anybody that didn't go with the new right-wing program. So this, if this was the Jose Padermo working the door when John Lennon was assassinated, I thought, wow, that's serious. That's not a coincidence. That's like one of the world's most famous assassins was working the door when there was one of the world's most famous assassinations. Got to be linked. I've subsequently found out Jose Patermo is a very common name in Cuba, and it wasn't. Op 40 CIA Jose Patermo was not Dakota Jose Patermo. They got very different age groups, and we know a fair bit about Dakota Jose, different people altogether. But they concealed his name after the murder for 7 years, so he became a bit of a kind of mystery figure. They never described anybody that was there that night in the media. The media were completely asleep. So all the main players, apart from Yoko Ono, were completely kept in the dark from the public. So once I'd gone through the Jose Padermo kind of initial research, I just started to look at the murder itself, okay, so where was he shot? Okay, he's walking in, he was with his wife. And then I started to kind of go through some different reports and I just thought, hang on a minute, there's a real lack of detail here. Like, where was he shot? And what did he do after he was shot? And what was his wife doing? And who else was there? And then I started to keep digging and digging and digging. And then eventually it all just completely exploded when I spoke to the surgeon.
Interesting. Interesting. So in our previous episode, we discussed what John was up to from the 60s up till 1980. Could you take us through Mark David Chapman?
Yeah, sure. Chapman was a typical child of the 60s and early 70s. He was born in 1955. So once the Beatles turned up, he's kind of like, 9, 10, 11. He's a fan, but he's a fan of all music. Chapman's big hero was actually a guy called Todd Rundgren. He wasn't a massive John Lennon fan.
I was a huge Todd Rundgren fan.
Yeah, Todd's a genius. Todd, those run of albums in the 70s, incredible artist. So that was Chapman's main thing. He had a military father, done they all, bit of a distant father, who then went and left the military and went to work for a bank. He had a nurse mother. He had a sister, real cookie cutter, Southern. He was initially born in Texas, I think, and then he moved to Decatur, Georgia. So classic Southern childhood. He was into music. He had lots of friends. He was very sociable. Nothing weird about him. He wasn't into capturing the riot. That's a complete myth. There's a lot of guys who've gone on documentaries and said, "Oh yeah, I grew up with Mark, and he was always reading this book." What a load of nonsense! Do you remember the books your friends were reading when you were 10, guys? It's just ridiculous. So, and what 10-year-old is going to read Catcher in the Rye? But anyway, we'll move on from that. So he had a very sort of okay childhood. He started to dabble in drugs around about the age of 14, 15. So late 60s, early 70s, classic LSD time, Jimi Hendrix, psychedelia. Everyone was doing it at the time from my research. So him getting into hash and then getting into LSD was a pretty straight progression from, with the group of friends that he was hanging out with at the time. He didn't do heroin. That's a complete lie. Again, people try to embellish. But he was seriously into LSD, and he had a few weird experiences with that, and he took a lot of it. He was quite into it, probably too much, and he had some bad trips. Some of his friends told me, so that probably didn't do his brain any good. But when he was sort of 15/16, Mark found God, and he found God through a local Decatur church, which was run by a guy called Charles McGowan, Pastor Charles McGowan. And Charles McGowan was ex-Navy intelligence, which is interesting. And he was in Washington working for Navy intelligence in 1963, which is a very interesting year to be in Washington working in intelligence. So that's who Charles McGowan was. Now, Charles McGowan was a pastor at this point when Mark bumped into him around about 1970. And Charles McGowan, with another friend of his at the time in Decatur, a guy called Harold Blankenship, were trying to set up a new strand of Presbyterianism because they didn't think that Presbyterianism was sort of right wing enough for them. And they were slightly concerned about all of the kind of liberal stuff like allowing women to be preachers and same sex marriage and abortion rights. That they wanted it to go further to the right. So they set up a new Presbyterian organization called the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America. And Harold and Charles were the kind of two of the sort of initial founding fathers, with a lot of other more far right, I would say, people. Not a nice bunch of people really, but very hellfire-ish kind of types who were all about, you've got to follow the Bible, and that's that. So these are the kind of people that Mark Chapman was getting involved with. Harold Blankenship's daughter was called Jessica, who Mark had a crush on when he was 15, 16. So she was kind of almost the lure that sort of brought Chapman into Harold and Charles's kind of orbit. Then, very strangely, when Mark was sort of 15/16, when he got off LSD, got off drugs, and started to go to Christian camps, he was sent with Jessica via Charles and Harold to a guy called Mr. Krause, who was a sort of, can I describe him as a kind of crazy exorcist? But of course, in Presbyterian circles, they wouldn't use that Catholic term. They called them, I think, deliverance guys. They sort of they
Right.
deliver you
Right.
from evil spirits. So Mark was starting to have these, as he described it, and Jessica's described it. There's these really disturbing sessions with this guy. It was like a group thing, and there was like, they were trying to cast demons out of Mark, and there was guys pressing down on his chest and pressing down his back, saying, you're possessed by demons, you're possessed by demons. And Mark just found all this incredibly troubling. And he said they talked more about the devil and sin than they did Jesus. So, and I think that was where Mark was initially, they were starting to sort of, the people who were going to put Mark through an MKUltra program were doing what we've read now and lots of research about MKUltra was sort of basically cracking him. They were cracking, and religious mania is a great way to crack someone's brain, to actually get them to sort of shut half their brain down so that you can actually insert something into that half that they can't cope with the trauma. And this was part of the techniques of MKUltra at the time that's now come out in lots of documentation and documentaries, and people have actually admitted it who worked on those programs. So I think that's where it all started for Mark. And then from that point onwards, it's just a case of Mark hanging out with people that wouldn't really expect him to hang out with. So he hung out with a guy called Dana Reeves, who became a sheriff. Dana was a very different guy to the Christian people Mark was hanging around with. Dana was, by all accounts, quite aggressive, was very much into guns. And I think this was shaping Mark into a kind of getting Mark familiar with a more kind of violent, aggressive, right-wing kind of mindset. Because a lot of Mark's friends told me before he got into Christianity, he was the classic kind of left-wing, hippie, easygoing guy. But once he got into this kind of Christian right-wing nationalistic kind of group led by people like Charles McGowan and Dana Reeves, he became a lot more right-wing and a lot more intolerant and a lot more shut down and a lot more secretive. And then, we can go on, guys. You want me to keep going up until Hawaii, or do you want to sort of jump in at this point?
I
Or
definitely want to get into Hawaii for sure.
yeah, yeah. I mean, to get to Hawaii, Hawaii was 77 when Mark was 22. But I think before Hawaii, he went to theological college. He tried to get into doing that kind of thing. He flunked that. He broke up with Jessica, but he kept going back. Interestingly, throughout all of Mark's life, right up until the murder, he kept going back to the Blankenship house. And it's interesting to note that, because the famous journalist Craig Unger, who worked, I think, for the New York Magazine back in the 70s and 80s, great guy, Craig, written some amazing books. He told me that when he went to speak to Harold Blankenship after the murder, I think it was 1981, he did a really interesting piece for the New Yorker. He said Harold Blankenship, A, was anti-Semitic and very hostile to Craig. But he also said that Harold actually admitted to him that he gave Chapman the idea to kill John Lennon, which I found quite interesting, sort of boasting about that. So I thought that's quite interesting that's come from that kind of Christian nationalistic kind of, and that wouldn't surprise me, because I think Harold was potentially using Mark's love for Jessica to keep control over him, because Mark kept going back to the Blankenship house constantly, right up until the murder, which I find really interesting. It was almost like there was kind of a control mechanism there in the Blankenship household. So leading up to Hawaii, Mark's flunked theological college, still hanging out with Dana. There's one other slight little detour he's had that was really weird. He went to work for a Vietnamese refugee camp for the
Beirut.
YMCA. Yeah, not Beirut. Actually, no, you're right. I forgot about Beirut. Beirut's different. He started to work for the YMCA, doing stuff like in a YMCA camp locally in Decatur. And for some reason, they sent him out to Beirut when he was sort of 15, 16. And this was a war zone. And he was there apparently working for the YMCA. Mark came back and said, there was a lot of gunfire. I found it all rather scary. But for some reason, Mark recorded the gunfire on a tape. Don't know why Mark did that. But when he got back from Beirut, McGowan was still in contact with him. And he got up in McGowan's church and he spoke all about his experiences in Beirut, which, as you guys know, was a very dangerous place for a
Yeah, the
young
Civil
Christian.
War.
Yeah,
The
for a
Lebanese
young
Civil War
Christian.
is going on.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk about, unverified, of course, it was a CIA hotbed, and of course it would be. They would have a presence there, as no
Yeah.
doubt MI5 did and MI6. Yeah, MI6 were probably there and every other intelligence agency, because Lebanon was a hub of all kinds of activity in the Middle East at the time. But then after Beirut and Lebanon, he then went to work for a refugee camp. Forget where it was now, Fort Chaffee, I think it was. And this was again under the auspice of the YMCA. And he became a counselor for these Vietnamese refugee kids who were coming in from Vietnam when their parents were killed, and they were coming in, and Mark was looking after them. And Mark got under the sort of spell of a guy called David Moore, who was another one of these kind of Christian guys who were controlling him. And Mark lived with David, which is really interesting. And David Moore is another one of these guys, a bit like Dana Reeves, where there's not a lot you can find about these guys. They're quite mysterious. But they're always there guiding Mark through this kind of journey. So there's a red herring about that camp, that refugee camp, because Mark was working there for the YMCA, but World Vision were also there. Now, World Vision they've got some links with John Hinckley's father, I think, who was one of the sort of major founders of World Vision. So everyone's kind of connecting, going, oh, Mark Chapman, Fort Chaffee, World Vision, John Hinckley, it's all a bush plot. It's a red herring. He was there. YMCA were there. World Vision were there. There were lots of other Christian groups there. Mark did his job. I suspect he might have been conditioned there. There might have been some nefarious stuff going on in that camp. But the Hinckley thing, I think, is a bit of a red herring. So after World Vision, he then decides, to the shock of all of his friends, that he's just going to fly to Hawaii. Simply said, I just want to go to Hawaii. Now, there's been all kinds of reasons given why. David Moore said that he gave him the idea. He said, it's paradise. Go over there, Mark. Why don't you? You've got nothing to lose. You've got no job. You've got no girlfriend. Why don't you go and live in paradise? Chapman has subsequently said he went there to kill himself. Maybe, maybe not. And he wanted to be in paradise when this happened. But he just went there, just completely out of the blue. And what I would say to you guys is, if you were running a Navy intelligence, because Navy intelligence is a theme that runs through Mark Chapman's life with regards to people like Charles McGowan, who were always in contact with him, who were Navy intelligence people. But if you were running an MKUltra program through Navy intelligence, which we now know Navy intelligence did through a guy called Thomas Neurat, Commander Neurat, who actually told a Sunday Times journalist in 1974 that Navy intelligence did have an MKUltra program. So he let that one slip. Where would you do it? Where would you? What would be the best place for the U.S. Navy intelligence to run an MKUltra program? I would surmise that would be Hawaii, where you have countless secret bases, and you could get on with it off the mainland, and you could program the guys through a hospital, and you could have them ready to go whenever you needed them to go. So the hospital that Mark ended up in after he allegedly tried to commit suicide, and slightly not sure whether he did or not. Mark thinks he did, but it's all a bit on the nose. He said, I put a hose in my car, and then a Japanese fisherman came along and saved me, and I didn't get the hose fitted right, and I was sent off to this hospital on the other side of the island. Just doesn't quite fit for me, but we'll go with it. Let's say he did do that. But the hospital that he ended up in was called Castle Memorial, which was run by the Seventh-day Adventists. We're a very interesting bunch of sort of Christians who have a very tight link with the US military. They've often in the past given up some of their followers, their conscientious objectors, to be guinea pigs for the US military. So there's a kind of strange relationship there between the Seventh day Adventists and the US military, which would have been quite convenient for what a doctor said happened to Mark when he was in Castle Memorial Hospital. Because according to a doctor called Dr. Bernard Salzman, he said Mark was put through a brainwashing program there. And he was put through a brainwashing program very similar to MKUltra. And Salzman went to the press in '81. He talked about the drugs they were using on Mark, like Thorazine, classic MKUltra drugs.
Mhm.
And the press completely ignored it. Apart from a music paper called The NME, who did an interview with Salzman in '81, nobody picked up on this because they were all just so fixated with capturing the rye and, John's dead and let's listen to Imagine again. Let's not talk about some crazy conspiracy theory that was happening in a hospital in Hawaii. But I'm pretty sure that in Hawaii is where Mark's programming was complete to get him ready to be switched on, sent off to be a patsy, which is what I think happened.
How does he meet Gloria?
Gloria's, this is again fascinating and again very strange. He's in the hospital. He's been treated for his suicide, but if you believe Salzman, he's going through an MKUltra brainwashing program. Once he's done that, and once he's cured, he becomes a janitor at the hospital. They give him a job there, which is very strange. So he's in the basement sweeping away. And according to legend, he decides he wants to go on a worldwide trip, as you do when you're a janitor.
Yeah.
So we're not quite sure where the cash came from for this. But apparently it was a loan. According to the Castle Memorial Hospital, they loaned their janitor.
Well,
Sorry,
that's
you
always
can.
my question is where
Yeah,
did the money come from for all
yeah,
these things? He's flying around, he's going here, he's in Hawaii. I mean, I don't do that.
yeah.
Prior to the
What
time he shoots John, he goes to Chicago,
yeah,
where
he
he seems to have a lot of money for a janitor.
travels around a lot. Travels around a lot.
Did he have a
Uh,
painting collection as well?
Yeah, there was, but yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah, when he gets back from the world tour, he starts to collect art, really high
Yeah,
end art. Again, money, no problem. But yeah, the whole Hawaii thing, there's just, he was hanging out with some very nefarious characters. That's all been hidden now. It's all been put under the carpet, but he was hanging out with the son of an Hawaiian detective and some of his friends. And they were being quite aggressive and strange. And when the murder happened, the media went to Hawaii, and this detective's son completely skipped the island. So there were people around Mark Chapman in Hawaii that have been completely buried from the official narrative, but they're there, and he was being controlled every second of the day, Mark, when he was there. But let's get back to this world trip. So he decides he wants the world trip. The very benevolent Castle Memorial Hospital Credit Union decides, yeah, sure, we'll give you all the money, all the thousands, and it must have cost thousands because he literally flew.
absolutely.
He flew everywhere. He went to the Far East. He went to Europe. There was nowhere that Mark didn't go. Really, it's easier to actually name the countries that he didn't go to than actually the countries that he did. He went to a lot of countries. So he goes into a travel agency, and he talks to someone at the desk and says, "I want to travel the world." Initially, he said it was a Far East thing, but then it became a global world trip. The girl that he initially spoke to was, dealing with him, but then there was another woman in the travel agents called Gloria Chapman, who decided to kind of step over her colleague and contact Mark unilaterally and say, actually, you should talk to me, Mark. I'm the one that can really give you an amazing global trip. So it's quite interesting that Gloria kind of forced her way into Mark's kind of arrangements, let's say. And then they became quite close, and there was a lot of flirting going on apparently. And then when Mark did go on his trip, he often sent Gloria postcards, and it was all kind of quite flirty. And I can't wait till I get back to see you, blah blah blah. But before we get to that, though, what is again not known, and it should be known because it's incredible, is the first place Mark went to when he went on this global trip was Mount Fuji in Japan in the summer of 1978. And it just so happens at the same time Mark Chapman was there in Mount Fuji, Japan in 1978, so was John Lennon, and so was Yoko Ono, and so was Sean, all staying at exactly the same place. Now, that is that a coincidence? I would say no. I would say, was Mark stalking John Lennon? Potentially. Was he going to be taken out in Japan in 78? Potentially. Obviously, that didn't happen. But what's interesting is Mark's never discussed this. He's never said, oh, yeah, I'm obsessed with John, always was. That's why I killed him. And I stalked him in 78, and I was hanging around in the same place in Japan that he was. Mark's never mentioned it. The media's never mentioned it. Very, very bizarre. And then after Mount Fuji, Japan, Mark went to India. He went to Nepal. He went to Iran, would you believe, guys? So this is pre-revolutionary Iran, very dangerous place at the time. Lot of kind of uprisings.
I mean, the uprisings were happening at the time, and the revolution, I mean, they took the hostages in November 79. So a lot of stuff is going on there. Seems to be showing up at hotspots throughout the world.
Yeah, kind of like a secret agent kind of thing, like a
Do you
kind of
think
amateur.
it's possible that he was an assassin prior to?
I don't think I don't think that's how they sold it to him. I think they just said, look, Mark, we want you to work for the government. It's a secret program. We want you to go to Europe. We want you to go to India. We want you to go to Iran. You're going to meet a guy, give him a package. I think there was a kind of amateur James Bond kind of persona they were feeding into him. Like, Mark, you're a really important guy, and we're going to send you off here to do this. Because, he went to Switzerland, he went to Paris, he went to London. He went everywhere. And it's kind of like, it's kind of money, no problem. And I just think there was a potential setup there, that it was like, you're one of us, Mark. And and I think that's how they managed to get him in certain positions, possibly how they managed to get him in New York before the event as a kind of undercover kind of guy there to sort of scope things out. There's two theories, and both have got great kind of weight for me. One is they really managed to split Mark's brain, and you had the killer on one, and you had the kind of nice, meek Mark on the other. Classic MKUltra setup. Or there was, like in Oswald, in JFK, there was two Marks, and there was a Mark, we'll get to it, the kind of James Taylor Mark, I'm sure, when we get to the day of the murder, where there was a more aggressive Mark hanging around New York, laying down a legend that Mark Chapman was an aggressive guy who was going to kill somebody. So it's very hard to say. Potentially both. Mark was allegedly approached. Well, we know he approached the kind of very dubious film director Kenneth Anger, so-called Satanist, and gave him some bullets. And that's true, because I've got the document that the police made out saying that Kenneth Anger actually went to the police and said, look, this guy's giving me these bullets after the murder. So that probably did happen. And Mark was attacking Scientologists in Hawaii, again, in a very aggressive way. That's all true. The Scientologists have put this on the record, that Mark was constantly harassing them in a very aggressive way. But then you talk to other people and they say, that's not Mark. He was a meek and mild guy. So there seemed to be this kind of dual personality thing going on. And whether that was all done in one brain or whether there was two people playing two roles, is really hard to say. But what we do know is that, Hawaii and Castle Memorial and the Round the World trip was all very dubious and all very well paid for. When he got back from Round the World trip, when he's in the airport waiting to get his suitcase, Gloria's there waiting for him with a broken foot. So she was really keen to be there,
Right.
in this romantic reunion. Hi, here I am. And, and then from that point onwards, they got married. She became Mark's, confidant. And Gloria is, a woman that's got a lot of questions to ask, because when Mark first went to, well, we should get to the summer of 1980. I need to put this all in order. The summer of 1980, Mark's lost his job as a security guard in Hawaii. Gloria's still working at Castle Memorial. She's left the travel agency. She's now working at the hospital that Mark was being treated in. So it's all very cozy. And in the summer of 1980, Mark starts to become obsessed with Catcher in the Rye, the book. Okay, first time ever. It wasn't his childhood thing. He just suddenly, that book became very important to him. He asked Gloria to read it. He wrote people letters about how obsessed he was with it. And at the same time as he was getting obsessed with Catcher in the Rye, he was also getting obsessed with John Lennon. Suddenly, John Lennon became his fixation. To use Mark's own word, it became a compulsion. And it is all about Catcher in the Rye and John Lennon, all in the summer of 1980. So November 1980, Mark flies over, end of October, early November, he flies over to New York to kill John Lennon. He brings a gun with him, but he realizes that he doesn't have bullets. Okay, so he doesn't have bullets. So what does he do? He contacts his friend Dana, good old chief sheriff down in Atlanta, goes down. Dana very, very kindly gives him some bullets, says, "Here you go, Mark." Apparently Mark says he wanted it for muggers. Very dubious that Dana gave him the bullets. Checked in with Blankenship again. Good old Harold and Jessica. Always, Mark, all throughout his life, he always checks in with the Blankenships, flies back up to New York. And then for some reason, he doesn't follow it through. He doesn't follow through the murder. He rings up Gloria, said, "I'm coming home." But he told Gloria when he got home what he did. He said, "Here's my gun. I was going to New York to kill John Lennon. I just got this compulsion to kill him. Your love for me has saved me, blah, blah, blah. I've thrown my gun away. Everything's great." So then 4 weeks later, he says to Gloria, "I'm going back to New York to write a children's book," allegedly. And Gloria goes, "Okay, fine. Yeah, sure, no problem." And Gloria, being an ex-travel agent, booked his plane tickets and went in the taxi with him to the airport. Okay, "Bye, Mark. Off you go. I know you said 4 weeks ago you went to kill John Lennon, but I'm sure you're not going to do that now." And off he goes. And Gloria has a lot of questions to answer. She really does. And I contacted Gloria a few years back and sent her an email and said, "Look, I've got a lot of anomalies about the case, a lot of anomalies about your husband. I think he might be a patsy. We need to talk." And she just went, "I've contacted Mark about your request," which I didn't ask her to do, by the way. "And we prayed about your request to talk to me, and we've decided not to go through with it." And I think what Gloria was doing there is she was basically saying to me, "If you want to get to Mark, you got to go through me, and I'm not letting you get to Mark." So you'd think any loving wife, which she still puts herself up to be, would want to know what the anomalies are that might, help my husband. But she's not interested in that, Gloria. I think Gloria Chapman was an accessory to murder, if you believe Mark Chapman did it. And I don't understand why she wasn't questioned about the murder. And it's really interesting that when Mark was in a cell 2, maybe 3 hours after the murder at the 20th precinct, Gloria somehow, incredibly, managed to find the phone number, managed to find the police station that Mark was in, managed to find the phone number and ring up the 20th precinct and have a chat with her husband. And at the time, a lot of the cops were like going, "How the hell did she get this number? How is this happening? How is she ringing in?" And if you listen to the conversation between the two of them, it's very painful. It's kind of like two people who know they're being listened to, who are trying to give information to each other, but don't want to say what they really want to say. It's almost like a kind of code. It's really, really bizarre. And yeah, I think Gloria Chapman is a highly dubious individual.
What do you think the chances are that she's an intelligence operative or was an intelligence
Very
operative?
high, very high, very high. I think she said on a Christian website that she lived a somewhat immoral life before she met Mark on her travel agency work. And I think immoral could mean all sorts of things, but possibly if you are living an immoral life abroad as a young Hawaiian girl, you might have got yourself into a few issues that might have allowed you to be compromised, and you have to work for people to make sure those issues don't come out. Or potentially part of that immoral life was her being, doing something in an intelligence vein. Who knows? I'm just, surmising here what could be possible. Gloria is a completely closed book. She had a father who ran a small bakery in Hawaii, not particularly rich, pretty stable. She had sisters. The father, I think he became a groundsman when he retired. This art collection you were talking about earlier, because just before Mark started to, go think about going to New York to shoot John Lennon in the late sort of August time, September, October at 1980, he became an obsessive art collector. And he was buying lithographs for Dali and things like that. And apparently the money came from Gloria's father, from his father-in-law. But from what I can see, the father-in-law wasn't particularly rich. He had to go and work after he retired from the bakery. So He wasn't sitting on a big fat pension. So again, money always a problem. And I think he had something like $2,500 in his wallet the night of the murder, the night John was murdered. He had an enormous amount of money with him. Uh,
And for how long of a period of time was he unemployed prior to?
pretty much all of 1980, the whole year, pretty much.
So
Yeah. So he had a lot of time in his hands. He was a security guard on and off throughout 1980. Had some gigs there opposite the Scientology Center, but not a lot of work. Apparently, he was drinking a lot. Who knows? Some of the people he were hanging out with, quite interestingly, were quite overtly gay, which is interesting. And I think he was actually living in one of these. The police officer's son I told you about was a gay guy, and Mark was living with him for a while. Now, you're not going to hear any of this in the official narrative. This guy's been
Right.
completely expunged. I think the fact that his father was a very high up Hawaiian police chief has allowed this guy to be, we know his name. The guy's sadly dead now, so I can't get to him. But, Mark wasn't this kind of trouble drinking husband of Gloria. He was out there hanging out with some very strange guys, not just the police chief's son, some other people as well, some sort of rock and roll type guys who were taking drugs. It was all very odd, and it's all been covered up. And, that whole Scientology obsession that Mark had, it's almost like a kind of dry run to see how far we can push Mark. How far will he go? Because interestingly, the Scientologist in Hawaii that Mark was attacking, the center, was having a legal battle with the people who were running Castle Memorial Hospital, the chief psychiatrist there, because the Scientologists didn't believe in psychiatry, and they were actually trying to give psychiatric patients rights, so they didn't have to take the drugs that Castle Memorial were making psychiatric patients take. So isn't it interesting that Dr. Mee Lee, the chief doctor at Castle Memorial that was overseeing Mark Chapman's treatment, was having a legal battle with the Scientology Center that Mark Chapman was strangely attacking months leading up to the murder? Is that a coincidence, or was perhaps Mark programmed by the people in Castle Memorial to attack one of their enemies to see just how far Mark would go?
right.
Possibly. Who knows?
Or a dry run or something like that,
Dry
just to
run. Yeah,
see what
for
goes
sure.
on.
But that whole Hawaiian Mark Chapman experience, it's never been properly investigated.
Well, there's
The only reason I can say this stuff is Barnett Salzman, this doctor who was working at Castle Memorial, this psychiatric doctor, he came out in 1981, and he gave a really long interview to the British music newspaper, The Enemy, and said, look, this is what they've been doing to him. He's been brainwashed, and we're giving him Thorazine, and, he's been programmed to kill in our hospital. And the world's media completely ignored it, which is just shocking.
Hawaii is fascinating because of you know how I look at the money associated with him. This world trip and buying art, and when he gets busted, he has over $2,000 on him, but he hasn't been really working steady. I mean, we're talking 1980 money, so that's you know that's a lot more than $2,000 now.
Yeah, and he was constantly being, in touch with hypnotists, which we need to get into once we talk about after the murder. There was a hypnotist called Jules Bernhardt who wrote a book called Self Hypnosis, quite a famous hypnotist in his time. And he said that he was meeting up with Mark, and he only did one newspaper interview after the murder, and he was never heard of again, which always makes me really interested in people like that who are giving an interview, they say the wrong things, and then they're completely, erased from history. But Bernhardt said that he was, he knew Mark, and Mark considered himself an avenging angel for Christ. And if John Lennon didn't come back into the arena, he wouldn't have been murdered. So you sort of wonder whether people that were programming Mark to think he was killing John Lennon doing it under a kind of like, you have to kill this anti-religious, anti-Christ devil, John Lennon, and you're doing it for Christ, Mark. You're doing it for, for a higher glory. It would have been a really easy thing to sell, I think, with Mark, who was always throughout his life constantly thinking about Jesus and the fact that he might have been possessed, and, trying to do the right thing, go to theological college,
Right.
you know, and even now to this day, Mark's really got into in prison. He's been completely indoctrinated into thinking that he's a preacher now, and he preaches to people in prison. He went through a horrendous 2 or 3 year period after the murder where preachers were going in these pastors who no doubt were connected to Charles McGowan, and basically trying to do exorcisms on Mark, and cast demons from him. And for a long time, he thought he was possessed. And I think that was all part of a programming thing to get him away from capturing the ride, get him away from the programming that actually got him to stand by that driveway on the 8th of December that night, thinking he was doing something that I'm fairly certain he wasn't doing. So yeah, it's that whole kind of Christian nationalistic right wing cabal, as I call them, around Mark. It sort of started with Charles McGowan when he was 15, sending him off to Kraus for his exorcism days out, and I think it went right through to the years after the murder. But it's even continued right up to this day, because if you want to get to Mark, not only do you have to go through Gloria, you've got to go through Charles McGowan, who still controls access to Mark Chapman. He's still in touch with Mark. He's still controlling that Mark Chapman prison experience. And interestingly, the day after the murder, Charles McGowan hadn't seen Mark for 3 years, allegedly, because Mark was in Hawaii, remember, from 77 to 80. And the day after the murder, Charles McGowan is desperate to fly into Mark to see him and be the first person to go and talk to him, which is, again, really odd. It's like you haven't been his pastor for 3 years and suddenly you have desperate to see him. And then when he got there, Charles, he insisted that he, because at the time there had to be a prison guard in the room when someone came in to talk to someone like that. But Charles said, no, 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 I had to have a private conversation with him between me and God. He played that kind of trick. And he got Mark's lawyer to get an injunction out to make sure that he got an hour alone with Mark Chapman in his cell before he went in there. Now, why would Charles McGowan need an hour's private chat with Lennon's alleged killer? What were they talking about in that 1 hour? And he got it. Charles got that 1 hour alone with Mark in his cell. The guard had to leave, and he got Mark all to himself. Why did he have to do that? What was he trying to hide? What was so private? Mark had thought he'd done something. The press they all knew his name because the NYPD said his name 2 hours after the murder. What was private? But Charles was very keen to make that a private chat.
So early December was the 7th, I guess he gets there, 6th or 7th.
Allegedly.
But we have other people seem popping up in various areas. The Yippies that were on Bleecker Street by the Bowery, John Denver. Please discuss sightings of.
Yeah. Someone said that they saw someone like Mark Chapman harassing John Denver a couple of days before the murder. We know John Denver was there, so that's possible. The rock singer James Taylor said that he was accosted by someone like Mark Chapman in a subway and pushed him up against the wall. A cab driver called Mark Snyder said he took a Chapman looking like guy around New York, dropping packages off in strange places, and Chapman offered him some cocaine, and he was talking about recording with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, real crazy. And apparently as he left Snyder's cab, he said, "My name's Mark Chapman. Don't forget my name." I mean, come on. I mean, that's just hard to believe. But, I spoke to Snyder. He's a kind of believable guy up until the fact when he told me that Mark was shape-shifting in the back of his cab. And then I suddenly started to think, well, maybe you're not as straight as I thought you were. Or maybe Mark was a shapeshifter. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who think Mark Chapman is a shapeshifter. But that's Snyder. And a guy called Ed Opperman, who I know you spoke about in your last show, podcast, that very famous podcaster, told me that, when he was at the Yippie headquarters, a guy like Mark Chapman came up and tried to get into the building. So there seemed to be a very aggressive Mark Chapman in the days leading up to the murder. But if you talk to anybody that was there outside the Dakota leading up to the murder, they would say, no, that wasn't the guy we spoke to. He was very relaxed, mild, nice guy. The two super fans, Jerry and Jude, the two girls who went to lunch with him, I think one went to lunch with him, but they both spoke to him a lot throughout the day. They gave a statement to Ron Hoffman, the lead detective, which I've got in his notebooks, and they said, lovely guy, just a real, Southern gentleman, couldn't have been nicer, couldn't have been sweeter, but they said he knew absolutely nothing about the Beatles, didn't have a clue about the so-called Lennon superfan. In fact, it was Jerry and Jude that gave Mark the idea to go and buy Double Fantasy that afternoon, the famous record that John Lennon got signed. So that was interesting. So you seem to have two different Mark Chapmans. And Mark Schneider, the cab driver I was telling you about, he became an attorney. And he was in court one day and he saw Jonathan Mark Chapman's second attorney who got the job. And he went up to Jonathan Marks and he said, do you still have communication with Mark? And Marks at the times did. And he said, yeah, I'm still contacting Mark in prison. Mark's thinking about an appeal. He said, could you ask him, does he remember driving around New York with me the day before the murder and dropping strange packages off and offering me cocaine and talking about recording with the Beatles and Stones? And Jonathan Marks said, yeah, I'll ask him. I'll ask him if he remembers you. And then the next day, Schneider went up to Marks and said, did Mark remember me? And he said, no, Mark has no idea about who you are or that cab journey. He just doesn't remember that at all. And what's really interesting is Mark was a big music fan, okay, in the 70s. James Taylor would have been well known to Mark Chapman, as he would have been to anyone his age at that time. Mark's never, ever said, I accosted James Taylor in the subway. Now, you'd think if you did that to such a big music star of the time, you might mention it now and again, but Mark's never mentioned it. So I think there was either a kind of brainwashed, aggressive Mark Chapman doing this, the sort of the other side of his brain that was ready to think he was going to kill somebody, or there was a double. And if I had to put money on it, I would say there was a double that was out there looking like Mark, acting like Mark, saying to people, remember my name, mentioning things like John Lennon and the Beatles, recording with them, just to kind of get all, it's almost like they're ticking off boxes, like be aggressive, mention John Lennon, say you're taking drugs. It's just tick, 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 tick. So the legend is set. So once the murder's done, because I don't actually think Mark Chapman was meant to live, guys. I think they wanted him to die. I think they wanted him to run, and I think they were going to take him out, Jack Ruby style, somewhere in Central Park or wherever he was going to run to. Because it would have been, would have been perfect if he did. Because you had his little display in his hotel room. Oh, he had a weird display, so he was a bit of a kook. He was around town a few days earlier being aggressive, so we know he was aggressive. And he was mentioning the Beatles, so he was obsessed about John Lennon, but now he's dead. But hey, it's all done now. Nothing to worry about. Everything's fine. The lone nut is dead, just like Oswald's dead. We could move on. Poor John. Let's play Imagine again. And it would have been perfect for them, but he didn't run. He stood there. And I think people like Gloria ringing into the 20th precinct and people like Charles McGowan rushing to his prison cell is quite interesting, isn't it? That these people were desperate to get to him when they didn't really need to be that desperate. McGowan must have known that there was going to be a long pre-trial period. Gloria must have known that her husband was going, once he was arrested, he could be contacted at any point. She could fly there and meet him face to face. But she was desperate to ring him. And the first thing she sort of said to him was, do you know what you've done, Mark? It's almost like kind of just, it's like an intel conversation. Tell me what you've done. Tell me what you remember. And McGowan, who knows what McGowan said to him? Because McGowan made sure that whatever he said to Mark Chapman in that cell was between him and Mark Chapman. Well, when Mark was in the last hotel, he stayed in 2 or 3 hotels before the murder. I think it was a Sheraton, quite an expensive hotel. Again, getting back to money, no object. He laid a display out on his bedside table, allegedly. And you had a Bible, you had a picture of Wizard of Oz, the Wizard of Oz film. You had a Todd Rundgren tape. You had a couple of photos of Mark at Fort Chaffee with some Vietnamese refugee kids. Charles McGowan's an interesting guy. He's still doing videos. He's got quite an ego, Charles. He's even admitted that that's one of his big faults is his ego. And he's recently talked. He's apparently the last video he did on some Presbyterian. Yeah, he revealed in his last video that he's writing his memoirs, which I was very excited about. But then he revealed they're going to be private and only for his family, which was very upsetting. So he's got to be in his early 90s now, Charles. Yeah, can't be long to go. Sadly. Yeah, I think a lot of his secrets are going to die with him, I suppose. Various other photos. And Mark told people in the NYPD that there was a display that he left that would pertain to the murder. That's all he said. He didn't give any. He didn't say he did it. He didn't say why he did it. He just said he left a display that would pertain to the murder itself. So they were in a real big rush to get access to this room. So you can imagine DA and the NYPD were getting court orders together. You'd know this, Steve, and they were kind of trying to get a court order from a judge to get access to the hotel room to get hold of the materials, which was denied apparently. First time I've got I've got the court orders that they were trying to seek. And initially it was denied, but they did manage to get into his hotel room and get these items and take photos of them. So it kind of built a legend. So if you can imagine, if Mark did die, either by committing suicide or by someone shooting him as he ran into Central Park, that kind of display would have been a perfect kind of suicide note, almost kind of like, oh, he's left a little kind of goodbye for us. So it kind of worked in that capacity. But what they failed to tell people, the media and the NYPD and the DA's office, who must have known this, because I've got the document, I've got the evidence voucher. They failed to tell people that Mark had 3 different lots of drugs in his hotel room. He had 2 lots of different white drugs, and he had a load of red drugs. And the red pills are quite interesting because red pills are the color of authority. So you just wonder whether Mark was on, these was allegedly sent off for testing. Of course, no one knows what came back from those tests. No one knows if those drugs went off for testing. Until my book came out, no one knew those drugs even existed. But I think with those drugs being in his hotel room, I think that proves that somewhere in the DA's office and the NYPD, they decided that something like that was best the public didn't know about, because it's just too complicated. You'll get people asking questions. And I think to me that proves that there were people involved in this case that wanted to keep it very low nut. Don't go digging anywhere you don't want to dig. And the reason we know that for sure is there was a writer called Fenton Bresler who wrote a book about this case in the early 80s. He was a British barrister who was very concerned that there wasn't a trial. And he just thought it's just wrong that there wasn't a trial for this case. And it really troubled him. So he wrote a book about it. And he spoke to a Lieutenant Arthur O'Connor, who was at the 20th precinct that night when Chapman was brought in. And he spoke to him many years later and he said, "What do you remember, Arthur?" And he said, "Well, what I remember is the guy looked programmed. He looked like he was in a daze. He looked like, and I know," and he said, "I know what you're going to make of that word." He said, "But to me, he looked programmed." He said, "We didn't do a drug test. We didn't do a proper investigation." He said, for 2 reasons, mainly. One, Christmas was coming and we had a hard year and the guys just didn't really want to go there. And the reason that is they basically were lazy, too lazy to do it.
I mean, Christmas is 20 days away, less than 20, but still.
Yeah. And he said the second reason was, he said, it was a grounder. We had the guy. He was there on the scene. He said he did it, or he thought he did it. He wasn't completely clear about what he said. I've got his statement from the night of the murder. It's not a clear statement. It's not Chapman saying, "I shot him 4 times in the back." It's a really confused guy who says, "Oh, I think I did it. I've got nothing against Lennon. I've got nothing against the Beatles. I think I shot him, but I don't know what happened to the gun. I just looked down and I had a book in my hand." It's almost like he didn't have a gun in his hand if you look at his actual original statement. But there's no detail. So all the detail was filled in a few hours later by the chief of detectives, James Sullivan, who said, "Yeah, his name's Mark Chapman." He called out to John. He shot him in the back. John staggered in. And that was laid down at 2 a.m. John was shot literally 3.5 hours earlier. And the legend was set. This is it. This is what happened. They had no chance to get all the witness statements in. They had no chance to check out forensics. James Sullivan laid it out straight away. And just to seal it, a journalist called Greg Katz, who was a freelance journalist, he didn't actually work for Rolling Stone. I got that wrong in my book. He did feature his article in Rolling Stone the next month in January 1981, but he wasn't a Rolling Stone staffer. He was a nobody, this guy, Greg Katz. But he got into the Dakota that night after the murder because his father, his stepfather, should I say, lived above the very driveway that John was shot in. So that got him access into the building. And his stepfather, would you believe, was a dentist for the US Army. He was the US Army's chief dentist. You can't make this stuff up. So Greg Katz gets in and talks to the concierge, Jay Hastings, and we'll get into the mechanics of the murder in a minute. But what Greg and Jay set out that night, John staggered in, fell down on the floor, dropped a tape. That was the narrative. That was where the narrative was set. There was nobody else that got a chance to set the narrative. So you had Greg and Jay having a cozy little chat at 1 a.m. And interestingly, Greg Katz never spoke about this again. He went on and had a really stellar journalistic career. He worked for CNN and traveled all over the world. Never mentioned the scoop of the century. Isn't that odd? He went in there, he set the narrative with Jay, never spoke about it again, which I find really bizarre. So Greg's sadly dead now, so I can't talk to him, but it's very strange why he didn't do that. James Sullivan set the scene, 2 a.m., press conference, 20th precinct. Guy's called Mark Chapman. He called out to John, shot him. John staggered in. And that's it, guys. Because there was no trial, that was the narrative. It was set. There was nothing else to do. We got the guy's name. He shot John, called out to him. But the problem is, guys, when you actually take statements from people that were there, i.e., let's get down to it. There were only 4 people involved, okay, apart from John. There was Yoko Ono, who arrived back with him from the recording studio, okay, when they walked into the driveway together, allegedly. There was the doorman, Jose Padermo, the famous Cuban doorman. There was Jay Hastings, the concierge, who was waiting in the concierge lobby office area, waiting for John to walk in, okay? And then you got a 4th guy, a guy called Joseph Manny, who was a kind of basement crew, part-time doorman, who was in the basement, allegedly, at the time of the murder. They're the only people of interest, really. You've got people out on the street who've embellished stuff. We can get to them maybe later. But they're the 4 people that's interesting. So let's start with Jose Padermo, okay? So I'd like to tell you guys what Jose Padermo told the NYPD in the DA's office, what he saw. I can't. The reason why I can't do that is his statements have been buried till this very day. They refuse to reveal Jose Padermo's statements. They revealed everybody else's. They revealed Joe Manny's in 1992. It took a while. They revealed Jay Hastings via Greg Katz, Rolling Stone. But Jay Hastings, like Jose Padermo, we don't have his official statement because, believe it or not, guys, Jay Hastings was not asked to go to the 20th precinct to give a statement. He was not asked to give an official statement. Absolutely bizarre. So the 2 people that went down there that night from the scene was Jose Padermo, statement buried, and Joseph Manny, statement buried until 1992. So no one heard Joseph Manny's name for 12 years. No one heard Jose Padermo's name for 7 years. Jay Hastings was interviewed and got in Rolling Stone in 81. But by the time that article came out, guys, Jay Hastings had skipped. He'd left the Dakota, left his employment. He left 2 weeks after the murder. And I said to Jay, why did you leave? He said, oh, they sacked me for being late. No, I'm not going to buy that. I'm not going to buy that you saw and experienced all those things that you said you saw and experienced, and they callously sacked you for being late. That's just not flying. So this is the problem, guys. You know, we should be able to sort of, everyone says to me, oh, so many people saw it. Yoko saw it. People on the street saw it. Nobody saw it. So let's get down to Yoko. Let's face it, the most important witness. Okay, guys. Now, her statement that she gave, the official statement that was released in the 1992 book, that's kind of the most coherent paragraph that she's given. But she gave 4 other statements to Ron Hoffman in his notebook in the hours after the murder and the following day, which I've got now. And they are all very strange because the official narrative that Greg Katz and Jay Hastings set was after John was shot in the driveway, forget about front and back, we'll get to that in a minute. He staggers in, okay, into a vestibule wooden porch area, walks in, opens that door, pulls the door open, goes in. He's in a kind of phone booth porch area now with glass doors. Walks up 6 steps, fairly steep, goes through 2 mahogany doors, probably open, possibly not. Let's say they were open. Goes through those doors. He's in a small lobby area now. Turns an extreme left, goes through a swinging door behind Jay Hastings' counter, and he's now in Jay Hastings' open concierge office. Runs past Jay, staggers past him.
Yep.
There you go. So he's there now. You can see there's the street. Yeah, that kind of sums it all up there. You can see the stairs there on the top right where John's gone up.
Yeah, so he's comes in, goes
Yep.
up this way,
Yeah.
and then through that
And
way.
ends up in a back office, in
Right.
another office behind Jay's office, face down. Because I've spoken to all the cops that found him, and they all said, yeah, weird. He was like this, like a child, splat out, face down, in like he's going for like a dive in a swimming pool. They said, but face down. Who leaves a guy face down when he's bleeding out with four bullet wounds? Who does that? It doesn't make sense because apparently, according to Jay Hastings and Greg Katz reporting in the Rolling Stone, Jay turns him over to see how he is, and he takes his jacket off and puts his jacket over him. He takes John's glasses off, and he gets his tie off to do a tourniquet and all these things. Jay has now told me in interviews that I did with him in 2021, he said, no, I didn't do any of that. He said, I didn't have my jacket on. I didn't take his glasses off. I didn't take my tie off. But Jay is now embellishing. So when he talks to Greg Katz on the night of the murder, he says, John came in, staggered in, fell on the floor, doesn't say which floor, and dropped a tape. That's all he says, right? He doesn't say he ran into a back office. He doesn't talk to Jay. But now Jay wants us all to believe that as he runs past Jay, he says, I'm shot, twice, and runs into a back office and collapses. So Jay's adding now. Jay's giving us a much easier story to believe how John got from that driveway, being shot in that driveway, and ending up in a back office face down. So he's given us the full journey now.
But that's
Problem
common.
is,
I mean, I've interviewed a lot of people in my life who, done
yeah, of
investigations.
course,
It kind of, as time goes on, they insert themselves larger into the story,
for
right? And
sure,
almost create a narrative that puts them there as a player,
for sure.
right?
And Jay's
Or
done
the
that,
opposite. I don't remember anything. Those are
for
the
sure.
two scenarios.
Now, interestingly, Yoko Ono, in her statements, what she should say is, John got shot, went in the vestibule, ran up the stairs, ran into Jay's office, ran into a back office, and I followed him because Jay said that Yoko came running in saying, John's been shot, John's been shot. Problem is, Yoko doesn't do that. In all her statements, she says, we got to the door, John said, I'm shot, and that's it. She won't go past the vestibule door stair area. She won't go into the lobby. She won't go into Jay's office. She won't go into a back office. All of her statements don't mention any of those things. It's almost like she's not prepared to take the story that far because it's ridiculous. It's interesting. She's not given us statements that match what Jay Hastings and the official narrative are saying, which is really interesting. It's kind of like she's not prepared to go along with it. And after she gave her final statement 10 days after the murder, she's never spoken about it again, ever. So whenever she's gone on or the hundreds of documentaries that she's gone on over the years since the murder, she talks about that day and she says, yeah, we were recording, got in a limo, got home to the Dakota. But she never then goes beyond, and it was terrible. And yeah, I don't, she won't discuss the details. So we have nothing from Yoko that actually fits. Jay Hastings only gave a few brief words to a Rolling Stone guy and wasn't asked to give an official statement. Joe Manny's statement came out 12 years later, and we'll talk about Joe in a second because he's important with regards to the gun. And Jose Padermo's statement is still being concealed. So what you've got is a group of people around a very famous murder who are not giving us coherent, full statements that match with the facts that we have to hand. So that to me just stinks.
Before we get to the shooting and the statements, I just would like you to touch upon John's security
Yeah,
that day.
good one. Good idea. Good idea. John's security was supplied by a guy called Doug McDougal. And what's interesting about Doug McDougal is he was an ex-FBI agent. Okay. Now, like a lot of ex-FBI agents who was in counterintelligence in New York, operating after, apparently going after Soviet spies, KGB spies. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that magnificent program, The Americans, about KGB sleeper spies in America. The people that were chasing them were fairly obsessive and fairly ruthless. And I think the ruthlessness came from both sides. It came from the KGB agents, obviously, and it came from the FBI who were chasing them. So Doug McDougal, being a guy that went after these kind of guys, was a very serious dude. Apparently he was 6'3", big build, Scottish heritage, a serious individual, Doug McDougal. From an unverified source, I was told he worked with a guy called Richard Bates, who ran the Boston FBI office. And Bates and him did a lot of these kind of counterintelligence, KGB agent stuff in New York together in the 60s and 70s. So, and I've also heard from another unverified source that they were very much kind of black ops. If we need to deal with someone and throw them off a building, that's not a problem. So we're talking about a very serious individual. Now, how does a guy like that, who apparently, according to people that worked with him, they've told me that he had a very far right, not right wing, far right political persuasion. So how does a guy like that, considering what the FBI did to John throughout the 70s, tracking him and bugging his phone and trying to get him deported, how does an ex-FBI agent like Doug McDougal get to become the Lennon security in 1980? So I've managed to piece it all together. What's happened is 1977, John was getting these really weird letters from a Puerto Rican socialist revolutionary group, would you believe, which I believe are fake. I don't believe they're real. The group was real, but I think these letters are fake. They've certainly never taken responsibility for it, the people that are in this group. And these letters are kind of along the lines of, and you can find them all online. If people just put in Puerto Rico, FBI 77, John Lennon, you can read all the files. They've all been released now. A great guy called John Whelan got them all released on FOIs. So basically, these letters say, we're gonna kidnap your son if you don't give us £100,000. And then the next one would say, you've ignored us, so it's now £120,000, and we're going to kidnap your son and torture him. And then these letters go on from the summer of 77 till the spring of 78. Okay. And each letter gets a little bit more aggressive, and the FBI get involved. Okay. So the FBI get involved because the letters say, almost comically, right from the start, and whatever you do, John, don't contact the FBI. So the next letter, whatever you do, John, don't contact the FBI. So, of course, John's frightened for his son, obviously, as any father would be. So he contacts the FBI, obviously. Of course he did. And the FBI say that he contacted him because you can see the correspondence between the two of them. And would you believe, guys, the FBI starts to bug and survey the Dakota in the basement, in the lobby. So now the FBI, interestingly,
Well, they did have
have
their
got
stuff.
eyes.
They had their stuff left over from the early 70s, so it probably wasn't such a jump.
Exactly. So they got that. So the FBI got their eyes and ears in the Dakota. Okay. And would you believe, as they're doing this, Doug McDougal starts to work for the Lennons in 78. Okay. Of course, he's the guy, no doubt, that they went, why don't you use this guy? This guy will protect you, John. This guy will protect you, okay? He's a handy guy, and you need protection because these people are going to kidnap your son. So this is Doug. You know, he's Scottish. He loves a whiskey. Very handy. That's how Doug got in, okay? And Doug was there from 78 right up until 80. But he stopped working for the Lennons, allegedly in sort of September time, early autumn in 1980, allegedly because Yoko was being too free in the press about their comings and goings from the Dakota to the record studios. And Doug allegedly said to Yoko, you need to stop telling people your movements. You're putting yourself in danger. So we're being asked to believe that Yoko then put him on a leave of absence. Okay. And he was told to not work for them for a while, which is just doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense on any level. If they're coming and going all the time to recording studios, why would you ask your bodyguard who's asking you to be a bit more careful? Why would you put him on a leave of absence? It just makes no sense. But that apparently is the legend